Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Bit by Bit. We're a little bit late this time around, probably because of this little event called WWDC. I'm not sure if you've heard of it or not. It's Apple's event that happens usually once every year where they announce the future of, this little operating system called iOS, I think. I don't know. I mean, there's some kind of weird name for this weird fruit company that they come up with every year. So this time around, we thought, let's take a look at them under the microscope, see what they had to offer, and how does it compare to, the other small company called Google, which is definitely not facing any antitrust issue related lawsuits right now. They're a super clean company. They're fantastic to work with, So let's just have a look at and have a small discussion about these companies. So we've got two people today. As you can see, there's three of us in total. I've got Vaibhav and Kevin. Kevin's joined on the show previously. He is one of the biggest Apple geeks that I know of. He's also used Android. He's on both of them. But if I was to place Kevin, I'd put him more on the iOS side, and then Vaibhav is definitely a very Android guy. So I'm going to try to be the voice of reason in this podcast. I use Android 6 months a year, and I use iPhone 6 months a year. So I'm going to try to balance here. But let's get started and let's get, yes, we know Apple is super important, but let's start with something that's even more important. There's a company called OnePlus, which everybody worships. And if you don't know about OnePlus, I don't really need to walk or anything. This is the biggest company to come out of China. Forget Huawei, forget Chinese army. OnePlus is what you want to go to. So they have apparently got a new phone that's going to be coming out pretty soon. So let's quickly talk about that before we jump into WWDC. But why don't you give us a little bit on that?
All right. So we've been hearing a lot about like the OnePlus Nord, and that's been confirmed. So it's going to be called Nord by OnePlus. That's the new company's name. Now, initially, we all thought Nord would be the name of OnePlus's EarPods or the wireless headphones that they're rumored to be announcing. I think July 10th is when everything's going to go official. So about a few more weeks until we know more about the company. But to me, I feel like Nord is a way for OnePlus to sort of target specific markets. So you know how Realme has their company Narzo and Xiaomi has their company Poco, and they're more focused on specific markets, like especially India. And I think Nord is just another company from OnePlus trying to do the exact same thing.
Look, I mean, we've spoken about this a little bit before. Why do Chinese companies feel the need to create a completely new company?
Okay, so I have one solid reason for that. And I'm sure Kevin might have a few reasons, but the one reason I think they're doing it is because if you've been following the international situation with China and India and how India wants to sort of get into becoming more self-sufficient when it comes to parts, they don't want to rely on China that much. If, let's say, OnePlus makes this company called Nord and say they were to promise that everything from manufacturing all happens in India, providing jobs to Indians, that sort of is perceived better for, an Indian market than, let's say, OnePlus, who has a very, very high level of Chinese backing. So if you talk about OnePlus, for example, you immediately associate it with a Chinese, with the Chinese tag. Whereas if it's Nord by OnePlus, people may perceive it to be more of an Indian company, and that's how they can get through that international barrier. I think that's what OnePlus is trying to do with Nord. And I think even with Poco, they're doing the same thing. Xiaomi, Poco. Poco seems more like an Indian company than Xiaomi does, because most of the manufacturing and et cetera needs to now happen in India if they want to sustain that level of demand, I think.
Look, I mean, we're not a political show at all, but I mean, yes, you can probably fool the customers or consumers at the end of the day, but governments would pretty much know, right? I mean, the money is going back to OnePlus's pocket or Xiaomi's pocket at the end of the day. So, it's obviously it's the governments that have issues. So how are you going to get around that?
I do not know, because That's what I'm saying. I'm speaking more from a consumer perspective, not necessarily from a government perspective, because that's a whole different issue. But at least to get the consumers on board, they need to do that. I don't know if you were like following Micromax when it came out in like 2012,
That was an
2013.
Indian company, right?
That was an Indian company, but then they started importing Chinese products and just rebadging them with their company name. So I think one of the companies they had, a sub-brand of Micromax, believe it or not, was called YU. I think that's what it was called. And basically they imported Chinese products, removed the branding, added their own branding, and sold it as an Indian phone. And people believed that Micromax, therefore, was an Indian brand.
Yeah.
And I think
it's not hard to fool the consumers. You know, I think the nerds will always see right through it. But yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is that like OnePlus is kind of shifting back to their like, you know, origin in terms of getting that like kind of more mid-range like value phone, since they've kind of shifted more towards you know, your top tier kind of what are you normally calling your those phones?
I think no, absolutely. I mean, they started out as a flagship killer, right? And then they ended up becoming flagship themselves.
Flagship, so, yeah. So they're definitely going for big flagship. Now they're kind of, at least with this, you know, re-optics, they're going back for their, you know, mid-range flagship killer, but there's a few compromises per usual.
Having said that, I am excited about the phone.
My only question though is, like, they have the OnePlus 8 and they're targeting Nord to be European as well as India specific. That's what I've read or heard. And the OnePlus 8 is in both markets. So how much of a difference will this Nord phone bring in terms of comparison with the 8? Like, will it have a worse off camera? Will it have a worse off screen? Like, what sort of sacrifices would OnePlus make?
Well, okay, so they're targeting a price of what, $300 to $400 with this, I'm guessing?
Yeah,
so,
I think so.
You know, you're probably
around
not
the
looking
iPhone
at
range.
Yeah, so around iPhone SE or something. So basically, they're probably not going to have an 8 series Snapdragon processor, or not the 8600 series or 860 series. You know,
855.
Well, or no, I would say even on what was the budget one with 5G capabilities that Qualcomm is?
765 G.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I would think that it would be somewhere around that. Probably OLED. I think OLED's quite cheap nowadays. So,
90 hertz.
That's a good question. Yeah, that's. But then again, we've seen Realme do that, right? I mean, Realme released their phone with 90 hertz on the cheaper side of things. So
but then that was an IPS.
That was an IPS. Yes, that was an IPS. I guess we'll find out soon. July.
I don't think they can go back on their 90 hertz promise now that they've like marketed it so heavily. They can't be like, oh, we have this 90 hertz phones, but 60 hertz is still good enough, so buy this phone. Like, I don't think that works.
But it's a brand new company. It's not the same company saying the same shit, right? It's a completely new company saying new shit. So, you know.
So they'll just say our philosophy is different, and so you buy 60 hertz.
Yeah, pretty much. So this is the cheap phone for people who don't want to pay for our expensive phones. Now I guess we'll find out.
I don't know. I feel like it'll flash a lot. It'll flash a lot with their 8. And people, because of how known OnePlus is, they'll obviously compare it with the 8.
We'll find out next month.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right, so let's move on to WWDC. So what do you guys want to start with? We've got Mac, iPhone, and iPad, and I'm sure all of us have thoughts on everything. So Kevin, why don't you choose the one that we should start with?
Yeah, let's go in the running order. Let's start with iOS.
Okay. Cool. So so I'm just going to say my quick 20-second what I felt about it was very Android-ish, I'd say. If I was to look for one word, I mean, you've got widgets, you've got an app drawer, you've got apps that are installed on demand, or slices apps that are installed on demand. So it felt very Android-ish. Having said that, even Android 11, when Google revealed or the public beta came out earlier this month, took quite a few things out of iOS. So I feel that these mobile operating systems are matured to a level where there's not a whole lot of innovation coming out of them. They're just taking pages out of each other's books, just enhancing them, making them nicer to use, nicer to look at, or more secure. At the end of the day, that's my 2 cents. Why don't you guys jump in as well and tell me what you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to agree with in terms of plucking and choosing what works best. But yeah, I mean, the whole entire widget thing has been something that Apple dipped into a little bit with with iPad OS in terms of having the widget stick there. And if you look back, like it's not like they've never done widgets before. You had them on Mac OS way back as a separate a little keyboard shortcut you could hit to bring them up. But yeah, it's been long overdue for them to do something on the home screen for iOS. Whether or not this implementation is perfect is kind of TBD. I know you had some questions about some of the app management in terms of whether the apps could sync all the way to the bottom with Gravity, or whether or not they're always going to go to the upper left-hand corner.
It's terrible. The first icon is still on the top left. I mean, you've got a massive iPhone 10 or iPhone 11 Pro Max, which is like a 6.5-inch phone, kind of hard to reach all the way up. And yet the first icon always lands.
I mean, on the contrary, I got it on the iPhone 7. So that just shows how much support Apple has for their products. But
absolutely.
I really liked it. Like, being an Android guy, like in essence, I really like the changes. I feel like the widgets, like you said, like they're still not perfect. So if you move them around, I don't know if you can see that, you can't position them wherever you want.
Correct.
It just comes back to the top, or it just goes back to where it
snap
wants to go to.
kind of within their little grid.
Yeah. That being said, I did love App Gallery. Like, App Gallery is a feature that I wanted on iPhone for a very long time, to organize apps automatically. And this is perfect for me because I don't like scrolling through all those pages to find a certain app.
I've completely given up on that altogether. I just search for my apps now. So the hardest thing for me to do is when I want to delete an app and I can't find it. So the easiest way I can delete apps is when I go to updates and I'll see an app that needs an update that I want to get rid of, and I can just swipe to delete it. So, because when you search for an app, it won't tell you like if it is in a group or anything, or in a drawer, like where it is. So yeah, like the fact that it will do some kind of auto grouping for you, and that you can even hide pages. There's pages of apps that I don't even want to see. So I think that's a very much appreciated enhancement. And the other big one for me too was default apps. I think most people like us really appreciate what Apple's good at, but sometimes the native apps aren't quite robust enough. So me being able to choose Chrome and Gmail as my default mail and browser, that's going to be awesome, because it's going to sway me away from trying to jailbreak my phone every year or every 3 years or whatever cycle we're on right now.
It's kind of interesting how they chose mail and browser, right? Those are the only two apps, at least in the current data, that you can choose to be different than the ones that Apple makes. Tons of email clients, but from what I know, almost every single browser that's available for any iOS device uses Apple's JavaScript engine. And it's not like Chrome is running its own engine on iPhone. It's just a skin with synced up bookmarks or username, passwords, or history and stuff like that. But you are using Apple's rendering engine, whether it's Firefox, whether it's Chrome, whether it's Opera, whichever browser is using on an iOS device. So I don't know why. I don't see how that is that big of a deal. Having said that, I love Safari on iPhone. I think it's fantastic. It's smooth, it's fast, it works beautifully for me compared to Chrome on Android, which chugs along. It's starting to get, I feel that it's starting to get very heavy for app usage. So I like Safari a lot, but I would have much rather have them give me the option to change my default music app, right? So Spotify instead of Apple Music, or Overcast for podcasts instead of their podcast app. Why not open those up as well? Why not?
Yeah, or even Maps. Like I think most people have kind of abandoned Apple Maps, despite whatever they tell us each year that they've done.
I don't think they'll ever give you the option to change maps. Like they want to push Apple Maps right down people's like eyes.
But the thing is, we don't have maps or navigation available in this part of the world. So
yeah,
okay,
the features
fine.
never come here.
Exactly. I'd be okay with it if it worked as it's supposed to work in the US or now UK or Canada. But bring those features here and then give us the option. At least
yeah. I feel like Apple Maps just works really well in San Francisco, and that's about it.
Yep, I guess that's their primary market for it. All right. So anything else about iOS?
Okay, one thing. I don't know if you guys got the beta on the iPhone 10 or higher. Do you know anyone who has?
I haven't installed it on my iPhone. I've got an iPhone that I want to install it. I've only installed it on the iPad. So
okay, so there's a feature on the beta where you can double tap and triple tap the back to do certain things. And it's not,
I think I heard about this. Yeah.
Yeah,
it uses the accelerometer on the phone, and I think that's great.
That's genius. Well. I will say that's genius.
So like double tap to pull down the notification shade, for example. Amazing.
Or launch the camera app.
Yeah, or launch Google Assistant.
Yeah. But no, I think that's a cool feature. I think that's a good use of technology that's been in our phones forever now. So yeah, that's definitely cool.
All right. So move to Mac or
iPadOS. iPad. Let's do iPadOS. Let me start with this, and I'm a bit disappointed with the iPadOS. I feel that they haven't pushed the iPadOS enough to justify breaking it away from iOS. Last year, they broke iPadOS away from iOS, and I feel that other than Scribble or Pencil support, I don't think there's a whole lot that is very different from iOS. It's a bigger screen, so obviously they need to incorporate bigger UI elements such as sidebar and stuff like that. But I was hoping that they take iPad OS closer to Mac OS. Instead, what they're doing is they're bringing Mac OS closer to iPad. So I am disappointed with the iPad OS. Unfortunately, it seems. So I feel that they are still very far off into incorporating features of Mac OS into iPad OS, driver support, whatever else it is that makes Mac OS so versatile. I feel that they probably tried to give it a shot. They realized that it's not going to be a year or 2 years or even 3 years for them to get there. So I feel now they're trying to pull the Mac into iPad territory until iOS can evolve to a point, or iPadOS can evolve to a point where it could be a replacement for Mac OS.
So what features were you hoping for? So with the first one, when they first made the segment, it was sweet, made some Finder enhancements, desktop browsing, those types of things, and it started to seem like it was going that way. But what would have been the progression for you?
So I think external monitor support would have been nice. I mean, if you could just extend the iPad desktop into a monitor and use that, I think that would have been quite nice. Then support for things like adding the camera to your iPhone. I mean, we have a USB Type-C port, but it doesn't recognize any external cameras at all. So that isn't there either. I think things like Final Cut Pro would be awesome to have, but you know what? Considering that they showed Final Cut Pro running on Apple Silicon on Mac OS, I'm willing to bet that it's going to come to iPad.
It's very soon.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean things that would make it more of a computer.
I don't know if you guys saw a leaked photo. I don't know if it's real or fake either, but there was a photo showing Mac OS running on an iPad. And that was to help developers sort of get used to the whole switch to ARM chipsets. So I don't know what to think of that, but Mac OS can run on an iPad. So,
well, I mean, it could virtually run, right? I mean, Apple could sort of just come up with a virtual machine running that and then provide access to developers for that.
Maybe.
That could be a way of it. You could obviously install it natively as well, if Apple allowed it to, obviously. But yeah, there are ways to do that.
I mean, that's just the way it's shifting, though, right? So it's like the the Dev Mac Mini is basically like an iPad inside of a Mac Mini. So if they have Big Sur, prepped to run on ARM, you could theoretically get Big Sur running on an iPad Pro.
Absolutely, 100%.
But yeah, no, I share the sentiment. I mean, I don't think I would try to push as much, of these things that you're talking about, plugging a monitor. I mean, maybe plugging the monitor, that might be kind of nice, but plugging external cameras and stuff like that. I kind of just lend the iPad just to kind of do more simple types of things. But yeah, I would like to see more Finder enhancements and more kind of, powerful OS level types of things in iPad OS rather than just being big screen optimized. I would like it to be a little more easy to kind of manipulate, files and apps and settings and stuff like that. So,
I mean, realistically speaking, there really aren't. You don't have a Windows kind of environment on iPadOS, right? Mostly everything is either full screen, which you can choose to run either split screen between two apps, or have a little bit of a section on an iPad where you're running an iPhone kind of UI on the side, but you don't really have true Windows running on the iPad OS. So again, I feel that it was probably a little too far for them to implement this, maybe another year, 2 years, 3 years, which is why they're bringing macOS closer to iPad OS. I've installed the macOS on a MacBook Air, and it's lovely. It's beautiful. It's really nice.
What do you think of the icon?
I like them. I think it looks really nice. It looks really slick. It's very iPad-ish. It's very iOS-ish. Even the font, the spacing, all of that is very iPad-ish. I like it. I think it looks quite nice. But coming back to iPadOS, so yeah, I mean, pretty much my biggest complaints with it are the fact that they didn't really push it.
Yeah. I think what you said with like external display support and external camera support, I don't think they want to do that because they're also pushing the iPad as the ideal sort of creative tool where they have the studio mics, they have the good cameras, they have the LiDAR sensor, so all of that. So then why would they push support for external things when the iPad is capable of all that by itself?
Well, that's the thing, right? I mean, if you're pro level, I mean, just look at Kevin, for example, right now. He's got a nice big mic in front of him. He's got, I'm sure he's got a monitor plugged in. If you want to push the iPad to a level where it becomes your primary device, which I would very much like. I would very much like to use the iPad Pro as my only computer. I can't. There's no way for me, at least at its current state, to do that.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think hopefully in the next year or two, you'll see some of those big asks that we've all wanted. Multi-user support. A little bit more of an easy way to kind of manage your files, and a little bit easier way to manage Windows and whatnot. I think there's a little bit of a learning curve with the iPad in terms of if you've never used one before with a more recent build, someone coming from an older iPad to a newer iPad inevitably is very confused as to how to manipulate Windows and do the app switching and whatnot. Whereas if you put them on a desktop or a laptop, they're kind of used to some of those kind of fundamentals in terms of how you kind of manipulate things, where you store things, how you switch things around. But yeah, overall, just in terms of the smaller things that they did add, the Scribble and other things, I think those are really nice, and it will kind of add to their kind of education and creative segment in terms of people being able to kind of not lean toward your Surface and other competitors that have already had some of these features.
Yeah, I will say Scribble is quite nice. I played around with it, showed it to my kids as well, and they loved it too. So I think Scribble is definitely a step in the direction.
Nice.
Cool. All right, so Mac OS, Big Sur.
Big Sur.
The transition from Intel to ARM. Let's sort of take a real quick cut over here, where I had a chance to speak with Jimmy. Jimmy's a developer. He's based out of Dubai. He was there during the initial transition when Apple went from PowerPC to Intel, and he had a dev kit as well with him. He spoke about that a little bit, and how I asked him how he feels about the transition right now. So let's just quickly hear what Jimmy had to say, and then we can.
Excellent stuff. Hey, Jimmy, how are you?
Good.
So you're like one of the biggest geeks that I know, Mac geeks that I know in the UAE, and I thought I'd reach out to you
Thank
after
you very much.
WWDC. I've seen your collection and I'm jealous. I gotta say, I am super jealous with your collection. So after WWDC and the transition that Apple is making, from Intel to Mac-based processors, Apple Silicon, as they'd like to call it, I thought I'd get your opinions on it, considering that you were actively sort of around when they transitioned from PowerPC to Intel. In fact, you told me that you've got a dev kit as well. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on what you thought of this transition. How do you think it compares to, when they made the PowerPC to Intel switch? Is it worth taking the Mac to ARM when a lot of people think that the future is iPad OS, et cetera, et cetera? So just wanted to hear your opinions on all of that.
Okay. Well, this is actually Apple's third processor architecture transition for the Mac, and the fourth overall in the history of the company. So they have a lot of experience, and there's still a lot of people at Apple who were there for some or all of those transitions. So the first Mac transition was from the Motorola 68,000 series chips to PowerPC. PowerPC was the first processor family that Apple had some involvement in terms of developing and the design, though it was primarily an IBM effort with some support from Motorola. So they went through that transition. It was reasonably okay in terms of what the experience was like for end users. There were some issues in terms of major third-party apps that took a long time to transition.
What OS were they using at that time? Sorry, I mean, I wasn't there for that.
That transition was with the classic Mac OS. So I believe the transition happened Mac OS 8, I believe, was the version of the OS that was involved in that transition. This was in the mid 90s, early to mid 90s when this transition happened.
Got it. Okay.
And then they had the 2005 transition to Intel. Which, and the other thing to note is that both transitions happened quite quickly in terms of the transition from the first product becoming available using the new architecture until the entire product line had moved to the new architecture. The Intel transition happened more smoothly. Apple had more resources. They had more experience with Intel processors because the OS came from the Next operating system days, and Next had been running on Intel processors for many years. And so it was a smoother transition for Apple, and the entire product line transitioned, I think, in a year. I think it was maybe 12 or 14 months between the first Intel Mac being launched and the last computer shipping with the PowerPC.
So let me just pause real quick over here. And you mentioned Next, right? Which was Steve Jobs' company, which he owned when he came back to Apple and then introduced it to Apple with OS X. OS X was OS X already at Apple when Steve Jobs came in with Next, or no? It was something that he brought in.
No, the reason Next was acquired by Apple is because they had no strategy for a next generation operating system. They had two projects that they had been working on internally, and both had failed.
Got it. So when they already had Next running on Intel hardware, did they have to port it over to PowerPC to get it going with Apple at that time, or how did that work?
Well, yes and no. The original Next computers were running PowerPC.
Got it. Okay.
No, they were running 68,000, and then I don't know if Next ever used PowerPC. I think there was an effort to port it to PowerPC. You're right. I think Next went from Motorola 68,000 family straight to Intel when they made the switch. So there was an effort to port it to PowerPC, which took some time. That transition operating system internally was known as Rhapsody. And then it was eventually released as Mac OS X for PowerPC only in 2000. And in 2005, it came out for Intel.
For Intel. Okay, cool. And you had a dev kit for when they switched from PowerPC to Intel, the Intel dev kit, basically.
Yeah, that from 2005, Apple, again at WWDC in 2005, Apple launched this development kit, which you basically, you paid for. You were allowed to use it for some time, and then you were supposed to return it. And they sent everyone a production iMac with an Intel Core Duo processor as a replacement.
Oh wow! Okay.
And it seems so that was a Intel Pentium 4 based machine. Apple never shipped a Mac with a Pentium 4. They went straight to Core Duo.
Yep.
To the core processor family. So this was with an Intel Pentium 4 processor, an Intel motherboard inside the case for a Power Mac G5. So it was limited in functionality. Some ports were not available that were typical on the Mac. And the machine only ran one version of the Mac OS, and that too specific versions, internal builds that Apple provided developers. So it could not be used for any real work after this transition period was over. And I suspect the same may be true for this new development kit that Apple has announced for the transition to their own silicon.
So this one's running the A12Z processor.
Right, which surprised people, I think, a little bit.
Yep, absolutely. I was actually quite surprised when they used the A12Z in the new iPads as well, because I was expecting an A13 version or some version based on A13. So I guess for development purpose, it makes sense. All right. So before we kind of move to the whole transition, first of all, in your opinion, is it justified to move Mac to an ARM platform so late in the game? And I say so late in the game because, as I stated earlier, a lot of people are shifting to iPads for, as their primary devices for work. iPhones have, or phones have pretty much become our primary computers now. Is there a justification to breathe this life into the Mac OS?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, the primary content creation tool for iPhones and iPads is still Macs. Right, to do the heavy lifting of writing software, developing media, editing videos for YouTube, producing all the content that people then eventually consume on these mobile devices, you still need the power of a desktop computer with a lot of I/O, lots of storage, large displays. And so the Mac continues to have an important role for Apple, not just the fact that the Mac by itself would be like a Fortune 50 company. If you take the revenue from the Mac, but also for the fact that it empowers the rest of their business. They are taking some steps. It's clear in the new Mac OS 11 Big Sur that they are moving to unify the experience of owning an Apple product, whether it's a computer or a mobile device or a tablet. But there's clearly still demand in the market for powerful, expandable computers.
So why not take iOS to that level where it offers the expansion capabilities of Mac OS, where they're literally taking the A12Z, sticking it into a box which has ports and all that. So why not just move iOS from iOS to iPadOS, which they've done, and then maybe a version of it targeted specifically for the heavy lifting, and focus on bringing Final Cut to the iOS platform, focus on bringing Xcode to the iOS platform, instead of taking the ARM platform and porting all the applications to that.
There are some underlying technologies in the Mac OS that don't exist in iOS and iPad OS that are required for all of these professional applications, for many of these professional applications to perform and to do the things that they do. And if you look, the most entry-level Mac that Apple sells today starts with 8 gigs of RAM, and they can go up to over 1 terabyte of RAM. Whereas on the iOS side, the largest RAM that any device has is 6 GB. And some of these libraries and frameworks that are necessary for doing some of these complex content creation just couldn't run on the same hardware. And so the OSs are different for that reason. The other thing is there's technologies like external storage, like Thunderbolt storage arrays, being able to run Unix applications, which are important to a large segment of Apple's computer Mac customer family, And if they were to try and just make iOS fit, it would not be it wouldn't satisfy anyone's needs. That doesn't mean that one day there won't be a common OS platform. I mean, if you look at iOS, it grew out of Mac OS, right? It's based on the same kernel.
Absolutely.
Many of the libraries are the same.
Yep.
So I think the way to look at it is that this is no different than the differences between tvOS and iOS or watchOS. They have a range of different variants based on the same core, and they're working to make the foundation of those very similar, to optimize resources and to make it easier to write an app that runs on everything. But I don't think they have seen any need or any benefit for them or for their customers by having only one operating system across the mobile devices and the computers.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
Yeah.
My concern is that even though they showed both Microsoft and Adobe working on applications for the ARM-based Mac, you know, does it really make sense for Microsoft or Adobe to continue working across two different operating systems or platforms for, yes, you're right that, you know, Mac itself is a Fortune 500 kind of company. It's big, but when you look at the total PC shipments, it's usually at number 5 or number 4, somewhere around there. When you look at Dell and Lenovo and HP and stuff like that. So, I mean, will it make sense for them to put in the resources to sort of develop apps, you know, Microsoft Office, Photoshop, Premiere, for this, again, a new platform when they could kind of focus on doing the same things on iPad or iOS, iPad OS, where, you know, people are already, they're quite far ahead in that game already. They've, you know, Photoshop's already come out for iOS. Microsoft Office is already available for the iOS, and it's been available for the last year or 2 years. So they have had time to optimize it as well. So wouldn't it make more sense for third-party developers to focus a bit more on the iOS side of things versus
in fact, I think Apple recognizes that. That's why they have this technology, Mac Catalyst, that allows developers to easily bring iPad apps to the Mac. And this would allow a lot of developers to produce one code base that can be used to build an iPad version and a Mac version without having to do a lot of re-engineering. And maybe 10% of the code is different, 90% is common. So I think that's what's going to happen over time. In the short term, this transition to ARM has been planned by Apple for many years. It's clear because if you look back at the changes that have happened to Mac OS and the requirement for Mac developers to adopt first if you want to ship for Apple's Intel machines, you had to only use Apple's development tools. You couldn't use any third-party development tools, which was not the case for PowerPC and earlier. There was multiple vendors whose programming tools you could use and compilers to make Mac software. So first you have to use Xcode from Apple. Then they made the transition from 32-bit to 64-bit only apps.
Yep, correct.
During that transition, the changes that a lot of developers had to make will make it much easier for them to make this transition from Intel to ARM. Another thing Apple did is when they started implementing their A-series processors, they architected the way they use those processors to be very compatible with the way code is compiled for Intel x86. You know, there's this concept of little endian and big endian. When you have a number that you're feeding into the processor, what's the most significant digit is on the right or the left. And so Apple chose to go with the Intel x86 approach. And that means that, honestly, I think that for most app developers, you're looking at a couple of weeks work to be able to produce a version of your app that can compile for either Intel or for Apple's ARM. And it doesn't require a new user interface. It's not a new operating system. Well, they have to tweak to support the look of the new OS. It does have a new look, but it's not dramatically different.
Sure. You're absolutely right about that. In fact, I think on my Twitter feed today, I saw some developer posting where they literally just had to recompile the app for it to run on an ARM. There was 0 changes required from that.
It'll be a lot of work for people like Adobe and Microsoft and others.
Absolutely.
But it's something which is achievable over the summer.
Okay.
It's not something which will require years of work or a complete ground-up re-architecture. If you look, as you mentioned, both these companies are shipping ARM apps already. Microsoft has Windows for ARM. Microsoft is selling an ARM-based Windows computer. They have Office running on iPad OS. and on Android. All Android phones are ARM. So this is not a foreign architecture for these developers. It's already something that they're dealing with.
That makes a lot of sense. That definitely makes a lot of sense. You touched upon Windows on ARM. Now, Microsoft hasn't really been very successful with that. Windows on ARM has existed for the past, I believe, 2.5 years. Microsoft has their own Surface Pro X, I believe, which runs on that, but they haven't been able to crack it. Do you think Apple will do a better job at it?
Apple's not going to give people a choice, right? Come 2022, by the end of 2022, based on what they've said, they will not be selling any more Intel Macs, or any new products that are launched will be launched with their silicon. They may still continue to sell the Intel-based Macs for some time after that. So Apple's developer ecosystem and their customers are going to have to, get on board. And I think that based on past history, when they move from PowerPC to Intel, I think the latest you can expect the Mac OS to continue to support Intel-based Macs would be like 2024 would be the last release. Last year, maybe, that Apple will continue to release new versions of the Mac OS that supports Intel hardware. After that, there will be no more updates. They supported PowerPC, I think, for 3 years after the transition.
Yeah. I think during the transition, Rosetta was a very important part of that, and they're sort of, using the same name for the transition this time around as well. So I was there when this happened, when the transition from PowerPC to Intel happened, and I had used applications running on Rosetta fairly okay. It wasn't a terrible experience, I'd say. Now that they're moving to ARM, do you think we'll see a smoother, better experience, considering hardware's come a long way since 1995 or 2005? Sorry. Do you think it's going to be much smoother this time around?
I think that it should be. Let's hope it is. It depends on how Apple executes. The reason that it went reasonably well during the Intel transition is that the Intel processors were so much more powerful and capable than the PowerPC processors that were there before, that when you ran those applications in emulation, they didn't feel much worse than they did on the previous PowerPC machines, even though in comparison to an Intel native version of that app, they were slow. In this case, I don't think this A12Z, I am almost positive, will not appear in any production computer that Apple sells as a Mac. And they wouldn't announce this transition unless they had designs ready for the entire product line, from thin and light notebook all the way up to a Mac Pro, competing with the Intel Xeon. So I'm sure that their approach will be to provide enough horsepower in the CPU architecture that even under emulation applications run reasonably well. And that's what they tried to emphasize. They showed some demos. Obviously, not every app is going to respond as well to being under emulation, and some may not work altogether. We'll have to see.
But exciting times ahead for sure.
Yeah, it'll be quite interesting to see once they have complete control what's going to happen. There's question marks like Thunderbolt, but USB 4 unifies USB and Thunderbolt into one standard. So perhaps that's what they're aiming for. That standard is supposed to be finalized this year, which would mean that perhaps the Apple Silicon-based Mac that they intend to ship by the end of the year may be one of the first computers with USB 4. So that may be their solution for fast storage, expansion, and big displays.
Absolutely, makes total sense. Thank you very much for your time, Jimmy. That was a very, very, very interesting conversation. And
thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, looking forward to the new ARM-based Macs.
Yeah, I'm excited.
All right, so before we head into Big Sur, let's just ask the question whether it's worth Apple moving back to the ARM platform from x86 or not. Kevin, why don't you start with that?
I'm mixed about it. At first, I kind of took a hit in that, Intel's kind of the go-to for, computing these days. It's a unifying chip architecture, and it allows for all of the apps to work well, in terms of developing them, in terms of virtualizing. That was a big sell to kind of persuade people to switch from PC to Mac, and that they could use Boot Camp or Parallels, those types of things. But with that said, I think with Apple's ability to kind of make its own silicon, that they're going to start churning out computers very quickly, and you're not going to see these kind of like stagnant computers that you sometimes see where they're not updated very often. They've seemed like they've been kind of doing small refreshes a little bit more than usual, but I feel like these guys are taking a very calculated risk at switching to ARM, and they wouldn't do it unless they felt that they could kind of keep all of their market segments happy. So you're people who are going to appreciate the unification of all three of their platforms, and the pros in terms of making sure that they can still have a really, really powerful high-end computer. Because that was my other concern, is what's going to happen with the Mac Pro. The Mac Pro still seems so new, and all of a sudden it's going to be gone. But they'll probably keep it for say 2-3 years, and the Mac Pro will be the last ARM-based computer that they release in their segment, and I'm sure it will be an absolute monster again. And it was especially reassuring when I saw some news that the new supercomputer in Japan was just ousted the previous record, and it was a fully ARM computer. So
Yeah.
the power's there. So I think it's just a matter of execution for the transition.
It's unfortunate for the Mac Pro, isn't it? I mean, we had the trash can, which was sort of like this revolutionary new Mac Pro that replaced the old version, and that went nowhere. And now we've got this new update, which in most likelihood will not see a new update until it's, until we shift to ARM. It's going to stay as it is for 2 or 3 or 4 years, or how long it takes for them to make a solution.
Yeah.
Vaibhav,
Yeah.
let me ask you this question. You were on the fence of getting a MacBook for the last few months or so. Does Apple moving into ARM change anything for you?
I don't think so. It's hard to know how powerful or how less powerful an ARM-based MacBook will be. But knowing Apple, like Kevin said, they're not going to take this sort of change or this sort of approach unless they know they can deliver. So if you were watching the keynote, they mentioned certain apps already being able to, render as good, if not do better than Intel-based MacBooks. So they're definitely planning it in a way where the transition period doesn't impact them as much. And plus, once the new chips start to come into the market, it'll be a sense of, people won't even realize. That's what Apple is trying to do. They want to make sure that even though they go through this change, they don't want people to feel the difference or feel the need to have Intel-based chips. So as in terms of me getting a MacBook, like you said, the MacBook 16 would probably be the last now to run an Intel-based processor, last new MacBook until the new ones come out, I think in October. That's when they said the new ARM-based, like we'll see the first of ARM-based MacBooks. So maybe if you want to sort of keep the last Intel-based Apple MacBook, buy the 16-inch, and that sort of sentiment sways me towards buying it. But at the same time, if there's a new one coming out and if it does everything better, it might have better optimization with Apple's software, given that it's an Apple chipset. So why not just wait another, 4 months? Because I've been waiting for years now. So let's just wait another 4 months.
I think it really just depends on what you're using. If you're only really using it for the Apple ecosystem, then yeah, like why not? But if you're a pro level person who needs everything to work and can't deal with some of the irregularity you're going to get, like emulating certain apps and any sort of kinks in the first generation, I think you're going to see a huge kind of creative group of people who are going to try to grab all of those last edition Intel versions of it. And who knows, maybe it doesn't become that kind of thing where the transition super quick and they just stop selling it. That they kind of it's kind of similar when they released like the Touch Bar MacBook Pro. They were still selling that previous generation one for quite a while, and certain people would lean on the old one, certain people would go for the new one, and it kind of made both groups of people happy, at least while they're kind of transitioning. But yeah, my suspicion, by the way, I don't know if this is true. You see some of the Big Sur icons that are kind of iPad-y, and
Yep.
you wonder, maybe these are done just to be unifying, or maybe they're done because there might be a touch element added to Big Sur that they're not telling us yet.
Yeah, they've been very, very, very anti-touch on Mac for the past few years. Every time somebody's asked them when touch is coming to the Mac, they've always been anti-touch on Mac. So let's see if that changes. Two quick thoughts on, again, I'd like your opinions on both of them, is that first, when they do decide to move to ARM with the new, so we're expecting one laptop and one desktop towards the end of the year by October, right? What if that laptop is that sexy 14-inch MacBook Pro that we thought we were going to get when the MacBook 13 was updated just a month ago? Everybody was thinking we were going to get a 14 inch. What if it's that one with Face ID and all of that built onto it? Same thing for the iMac. There are rumors that iMac is going through a huge redesign. And what if this new desktop machine is the new iMac with Face ID with a super sexy design? So what if they try to sell you ARM-based Macs with completely new design direction for both the laptop and the desktop? Would that entice either one of you into getting it? That's the first question, and I'll get to the second one.
I mean, there's a big difference between me wanting something and me needing something. Realism needs to be a reality check whenever these things come out. So yeah, I mean, less so on the laptop. I have a 16-inch, so I can reaffirm that it's a great computer. Should you decide to get one. But yeah, on the iMac side, I came off of an iMac previously, and it was a fantastic all-in-one computer. And I don't know, the touch thing would set me over if they did add touch to it for some reason, and they went for the full kind of, I don't know if you remember that like lampshade design iMac from years back, the white one that literally looked like a lamp that had that. If they went for kind of that like, Surface desktop type of thing where they just went all the way in and said, by the way, it's also a touchscreen, and that's why the rumors have been saying it's 24 inches, not 27 inches, because there's a form factor display cost issue for them to design it around that size. That might be set me over the fence and disregard my bank account and go for it. But if it ends up just being a new iMac that has a really nice sleek display, I'll drop my jaw and stare at it, but I probably won't pull the trigger.
All right. What about you, Vaibhav?
Definitely the 14-inch. If it comes with the new design with the ARM chipsets, it would entice for sure. But as far as the computer side, I don't think I would.
Okay. As for me,
go for that. But primarily because I'm looking for a portable MacBook, so 14-inch with that new design would be.
Yep. I think for me, I'd probably make a run for it on the laptop side versus the desktop side, probably because I would love to get, so I like the 16-inch. I think it's a fantastic machine, but I am not super happy with the battery life on it. I feel that 5, 6, maybe 7 hours is max I'll get out of it in a day if I use my iPad Pro and I keep my MacBook 16. I can genuinely feel that the iPad is giving me a lot more battery life. It will easily last me till the end of the day, almost till the end of the night, the iPad Pro. Whereas the MacBook Pro, I think by 3 p.m., 4 p.m., I will need to reach out to the charger.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I would love to see a much better battery life on a laptop, and I would switch because I don't think, so even though I push the MacBook 16 with the Final Cut or anything else at all, I do prefer using a larger screen for editing videos. So I try to do all of that on a desktop versus a laptop, unless it's absolutely required. So I would actually prefer the laptop moving to, that would be my preference, moving to an ARM versus a desktop. Having said that, now that you brought up the Surface Studio into the picture, ooh boy, if they do anything like that with Apple Pencil support on it, hell yeah,
Yep.
hell
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean,
I
it's so
think
much is overlapping. It's like there's literally no element that needs to be added. You know,
yeah,
if it's ARM and they're doing a redesign and you know they already have all of the touch programming, they just need to add the pencil and you know kind of
yeah.
figure out how the rest of the OS works. But um, yeah, I mean that's on the notebook end. I think a good question is what type of battery life would you expect? You know, with the iPads, you know, they have such limited space to stick a battery, but they're always, you know, keeping it at that, you know, 10
Mhm.
hour number, which is very, very good given all the power. But imagine if, you know, you could have a large, you know, battery within reason on a notebook. Do you think that they could maybe accomplish a full 24-hour battery?
I think so. I think that's what they're going to be aiming for. That is hopefully probably most likely going to be their marketing material for the ARM-based Mac, 24-hour battery. I think that's going to be marketing software.
Yeah, that'll be pretty impressive.
Yep, that would be nice. So my second thought about this was, look, I mean, we are shifting to, or Apple's shifting to ARM because they can rely on Intel to deliver the hardware that sort of fits their profile or the roadmap. The question is that, yes, we're all used to buying new phones on a yearly basis, but what good would it do, or how many people would actually be updating their laptop every year? Apple keeps turning out new processors every year. We don't really update our laptops every cycle. I take my laptop for a good 2 to 3 years, and that's when I change it. So, do we really need a new processor, or do you think they're going to continue releasing a new processor just like they do for the iPhone? Our laptops are going to be updated on similar frequency, and if not, then why not just stick to Intel, where every 2 to 3 years there is a reasonable update which justifies someone to update their laptop?
Yeah, I mean it's a good question. I think Intel has had its own kind of like shift in its chip line. You know, you see like that like even like the Xeon processors, you know, have kind of been up against like the performance of some of the higher end i9. Like I think it's been kind of shrinking. So them deciding what they want to put into what and kind of being at the mercy of Intel's, you know, roadmap when they're already kind of creating their own roadmap for all of their other products. I think that they're just saying we can just control the whole entire ecosystem and kind of not be relying, even if they, you know, do kind of stick with the same sort of release roadmap, but they can, you know, tailor certain experiences. Like I think you'll expect a lot more out of like, you know, graphical power rather than like the built-in, you know, Intel Iris graphics that you've been seeing on some of their low-end laptops. You'll see a lot more graphic capability in some of these, you know, kind of more mid-range, low-end ARM-based Mac laptops and desktop. The high end is kind of more the, you know, curious part because, you know, they haven't really shown anything in that, you know, respect yet. That's kind of like the you know, the ace up their sleeve. You know, what's this Mac Pro that's ARM based going to be? How is it going to play with, you know, NVIDIA and AMD graphics, or are they going to kind of do their own, you know, graphics cards as well? How is it going to play with, you know, other, you know, external hardware? And, you know, Jimmy mentioned that, you know, with Thunderbolt, like how is that going to kind of, you know, play in the professional market? But it just seems like time will fix most of these things. You know, they've thought very carefully about these things, and you know, Thunderbolt, you know, being absorbed into USB kind of lends well for this transition because they don't need to worry about that anymore. So
100%. But then, yeah, you raise a very important point, which is, you know, when it comes to professional applications, as you mentioned, whether it's video editing, 3D, or anything else for that matter, most manufacturers optimize their applications for NVIDIA GPUs or AMD GPUs. Will they now also add Apple to that mix? Well, that is something that we need to see.
yeah, that
They
should be
would
very,
have
very
to if
interesting.
Apple goes for it. If Apple does make its own Apple graphics, I think people will adopt it. They have to.
Well, yeah, let's see how successful the ARM-based Mac line is. I think that will answer a lot of the questions for these companies. So just the parting question for you guys. Do you guys think that Intel is the IBM of tomorrow?
It's a good question. I mean, they did what was the deal with the Intel modems and iPhones? Was that them using them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
So yeah, I think it's safe to say that Intel, unfortunately, in the Apple ecosystem, is going to be the new power PC. But I don't think it's for the same reason. I think with power PC, they kind of ran out of steam in terms of how much that they could squeeze out of it. There was this kind of mystical G6 that was supposed to be worked on, and there are all sorts of thermal issues and whatnot. Whereas I think the Intel roadmap is probably still quite solid. You'll see some amazing stuff in the future from them, but I think Apple wants to control more of the ecosystem, and they've gotten really good at making chips. And to your sentiment at the beginning in terms of Google dealing with antitrust, I think Apple could very well be soon heading the same direction, because they're going to control everything when it comes to the physical chips inside of their computers, to the whole entire market for portables in terms of iPads and phones and watches and stuff. It's going to be pretty wild.
Yeah, for sure. Vaibhav, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think for the most part,
you left him speechless.
For the most part, said.
Sorry, you got frozen for past few seconds. Can you just repeat that? He's having a bad connection. Bad Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Bad Wi-Fi.
I'm the only person who's wired here, so.
Hey, my Wi-Fi is working fine. I'm on an Apple device. What do you use?
I'm wired.
Windows laptop?
Am I back? I'm using a OnePlus.
It's converting
it's
your
marketing
text to
material.
Chinese.
It's marketing
It's
material.
converting.
Yeah.
No, it's converting your text to Chinese. That's what it's doing right now.
Yeah, it's sending your
Am
whole
I
entire
back?
transmission to China and back.
Cool. All right. Well, I guess we'll take off from here. Jen, it's been wonderful talking to both of you and your opinions. I think we need to make this a threesome more often, in the right sense of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Till next time. See you guys. Bye-bye.
All right. Cheers, guys.
Bye-bye.